Your moral intuition has been taken away from you.
Our civilization isn't an emergency. We are descending down ever faster.
And your moral license to act has been denied to you.
We have to stop being willing to sacrifice the future of our people for our convenience.
We will not abandon you.
We're in the conflict though. You're either serving your enemy or you're serving your side. Right? Those are the choices. It's not whether or not to be in the conflict anymore. We're way past that. That's a luxury we no longer have.
Where good people have to hide, evil flourishes.
We will re-give you that moral authorization.
If we don't have a revolution, in other words, we don't get a reformation, we're going to have a civil war.
And welcome to the 7th episode of Field Notes. This is the series in which I invite my instructors at Modern Minuteman on for a conversation about who they are, what their mission is, and then also what they will bring to the program, to our participants. And today I have with me Ian Berlingame. We have only been acquainted for a short while, for the last couple of months. I stumbled across his work online and dove deep into it, really. I ordered a bunch of his books. The Art of Being a Man, I believe, is called one of them. The Eternal War, I read that through. And he recently brought out a new one on modern knightship. And yeah, I've been quite impressed in how much EM understands about the particularities, especially of the English civilization, as contrasted from what people typically lump together as the European civilization. And perhaps he'll tell us more about that. But the area where I found his analysis extremely valuable is in understanding the historical dynamics of how rulers and elites either direct the happenings in the world, if you will, or are themselves actually subject to forces that are operating from the shadows. There's often a lot of conversation in kind of online circles analyzing political events or occurrences that it's who is it really? Is it the Vatican? Is it the Jews? Is it the hidden financial elites? Who is it really? And one of the terms that EM champions for this, or one of the ones that he talks about, is the Devil's Legions, or rather the Praetorians. And so I've already said a lot, and we can go into each of these separately, but welcome, Ian. Thank you for coming on. Oh, I could not hear you with your audio. Check that that's fine, but I'll continue introducing you, and when you're ready, you can. Okay, now you're muted. Okay, maybe it's just me. All right, I just double check whether it's me. Okay, still can't hear you. We'll see whether EM can rejoin. And hey, Clippy Man in the chat, welcome to have you. Good to have you again. Yeah, I'll just continue, and EM will try to jump back on again. So EM has been talking about these Praetorians, and who are the Praetorians? The Praetorians are essentially, well, as the name implies, a historically continuous force in world affairs, stretching back all the way to the Roman Empire. And in the Roman Empire, the Praetorians were the security force of the ruling elites, essentially. They were the martial elites who kept safe the senators, the consuls, and the other members. There we go. Now I can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes. And I assume our guests too. If you can, please do put a comment in the chat just so we're sure. but I was just continuing on who the Praetorians were. And so the Praetorians were the ruling, the security force of the ruling elites in the Roman Empire. And over time, they become a kind of quasi, shadow ruling force. Because if you control access to and have potentially also a knife to the people who make the major decisions in the Republic, then you likely have a lot of influence. And so that ends up then transmuting through the ages into a variety of new configurations. We have the Venetian Republic that carries that legacy on in the marshes of Italy. And then later on they moved to Amsterdam, and then later on even still they moved to the city of London. And so welcome again, Ian, and tell us whether I was accurately portraying that.
Yeah, so wonderful, and terribly sorry for some reason it didn't pick up my mic initially, but two parts to the Praetorian. One is the managerial administrative back end, which secretly owned and managed and controlled, if not the actual assets, because they were owned by a noble house or a senator or a wealthy elite or even the emperor. They siphoned off, the profits and proceeds into their own things and slowly, steadily acquired to themselves a complete empire. And the other piece was the Praetorian Guard. And now what we hear about history is the Praetorian Guard. But the Praetorian Guard were merely the muscle. They were the ones that you saw and the ones that you didn't see. But they not only provided security for emperors, but they were also the security for generals. So legatus, right? They were the security, so not military, it was the Praetorian. They were the security for the magistrates, which would be, the judiciary today, and for senators, for elite wealthy families, for the old nobility. So in every aspect of Roman society, civilization, across governors, so across the entire empire, the Praetorian Guard were the secret muscle that used assassinations and fought. We know about, many of the emperors that they assassinated, but we don't hear as much about, you have to go deeper in the histories, all the judges, all of the senators, right? These people were assassinating people left and right. Where was all of that wealth going, right? Where was all of that assets and wealth and the profits from going? It was going to the Praetorians, who were slowly, steadily, behind the scenes, all the business operations, managerial operations, and what would become modern banking as developed in Venice. So how do you use knives in the dark to influence people such that systems and structures are put in place that you can parasitically live off of? And then how do you siphon off of those gains into structures that are basically unaccountable? And right. In that, what happens, it guts empires, because the, ever more of what you are siphoning off, so empires, even great families, have to reinvest a certain portion of their, certain sizable portion of the profits of their wealth. And if those profits are being siphoned off, at some point the infrastructure collapses, the relationships collapse, you have to hire lower and lower capable people at higher and higher prices. And
you remove the incentive for the average citizen to participate in the collective
wipe
project.
out the middle class.
Yes. Exactly.
Right? Because who ultimately pays for it? You hollow out the middle class in all kinds of diverse ways. So that's the Praetorians. The banking, finance, logistics piece of that warped. When they set up the Vatican 1,000 years later, 600-700 years later, they made sure that they didn't have Praetorian guards. They brought in the Swiss. The Byzantine court made sure they didn't have Praetorians. After defeating the Battle of Milvian Bridge, they brought in Vikings, Scandinavians who converted, right? And then they went home and recanted. And then across much of the, when the papal states and all that were building out, they were very, one of the reasons for the papal states and feudalism and all of that was a decentralization that didn't allow for a unified Praetorian. You might still end up with some variant of a Praetorian system in some kingdom or principality, but that couldn't work with the Praetorians of other principalities.
That system would then have to compete with the other systems also available, therefore having an incentive actually to limit the degree of corruption they were able to perpetrate on the population, right?
Correct. So it allowed for this, so, where are we today? Where have we been really in the English-speaking world specifically, but in other, even in the old Catholic kingdoms, Spain, Portugal, etc., they ended up with the Habsburgs, they ended up with a Praetorian problem. And in the United Kingdom, what would become the United Kingdom, we've had a Praetorian problem increasingly since Charles II. And now they're, for people to think that the ultra high net worth people in the world, many of them who are created by the Praetorians specifically to build massive companies to siphon off, or investment firms or financial firms mostly, but sometimes multinational corporations, et cetera, to think that these ultra high net worth people, most of whom are created today, some of them organically, aren't controlled by their security, all of which traces back to, now what I call the Devil's Legions, which is all the intelligence community put in place post World War II. And, the private contractor, you can't get a job with one of these high net worth families in their security if you don't link back to one of these small handful of organizations. And not just link back, but you still have going relationships with them. So to think that we don't have a Praetorian problem now, which is I call the Devil's Legions because it's expanded to terrorist capabilities and cartel capabilities in the cartels, because it's not enough just to have a knife at the wealthy people's throat. You got to be able to intimidate the people, and more importantly, you have to be able to intimidate middle management, government.
Right. Well, we launched right into it. I like it. I guess my question now is, how did you turn on to this historical exploration? How did this become something of importance in your life that you would have to spend some time actually studying? Was it that you kind of stumbled across something and then followed that thread, or did you have an objective in mind that this kind of drew out? How did this start for you?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Actually, nobody's asked that, so kudos. Two pieces. One, I've been very closely looking at history since I was a kid, since I was a very young kid. It's always fascinated me, primarily the stories. And, reading was my escape from a rough beginning. And I also, at the same time, read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi books. Like I could finish a sci-fi, when I was a kid even, I'd finish a sci-fi novel in a day, maybe 2 days at the most. And same thing with fantasy. And so from a very early age, I was able to see overlaps between the stories that were written in the sci-fi and the fantasy novels, where there is all of this machinations and stuff happening in the court and people getting poisoned and et cetera. And then looking at history and seeing how many people have been stabbed by their own, security, or poisoned, or, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's one piece. And then the other piece is I had met across my life a number of even royals, nobles and royals and ultra high net worth people. And for the most part, with I think just one exception, they were pretty good people. And they were less so on the high net worth side, but on the nobility and royalty side, they were all about their people and all about, how do you fight this government and how do you, use what wealth and influence that you have to make sure the infrastructure is there so that the people can use it, and governments aren't siphoning it all off for their bloated payrolls and pensions, et cetera. And so, I realized, well, of course there's going to be bad guys there too. And that's not going to be consistent across generations, but they're not all bad. So that can't, so maybe there's something else going on there, right? Maybe they're not always acting of their own volition in things that are done. And that's two things, one, deception, and then the other is maybe there's something else going on there. And then, yes, something actually happened where I was invited to do a certain job for a certain very elite family. And what transpired in that process was just like a light bulb went off in my head. And I was just getting to the worst of the traumatic brain injuries. I hadn't been diagnosed yet. That would be another year, maybe 2 years later. So I couldn't really follow the thread at that time. Hell, I could barely speak, read or write. But as I have gone past the last, through the last 4 or 5 years and gotten healthier and healthier, and then really looked at, okay, here's where we are in the world. Here's what's going on. I was able to see more and more and more that there is a modern Praetorian problem. It is very prolific. It's everywhere at every level. And where it came in the continent of Europe, increasingly started in the 1600s with the Peace of Westphalia. And then in the United Kingdom, really with, it started under His Majesty King Charles I. That's why he was beheaded and killed, etc. But it didn't really take off until Charles II in the 1650s, and then really was instantiated, locked in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution, Inglorious Revolution. So to your question, one, I've seen patterns, and I really recommend people read good fantasy and sci-fi, particularly if it's got a historical bent, because they can say all kinds of things there that you can't say in a history book, right? And then I had a engagement myself with a certain family and the certain people who were the go-betweens for that contract, and it was like, oh, okay, maybe these people aren't acting on their own behalf.
I didn't realize that this actually was rooted in some personal experience for you, which is interesting because it tends to be the kind of thing that then actually moves one into action. When you can put a real face and a real relationship to something that for other people is more of an abstract interest or intellectual entertainment perhaps, it becomes a much different thing for your physiology. I mean, you're a student of neuroscience, I guess, and also like how we think and how we move through the world. And perhaps you can say a bit about how are we constructed that some things move us that much more than others, and how much perhaps does the internet and this kind of digital mirage world that we engage in on a daily basis actually divorce us perhaps from being in a relationship to that?
Yeah, another great question. Neurophysiologically, we are wired, the ancients kind of got it right. There's 5, 6, 7 primary archetypes, probably less, probably 3 to 5. And there's 13 storylines available to the human brain. And we're one of those archetypes living in one of those stories. And that's pretty much how it is. That's how we're wired. The ancient Greeks talked about this when, in the golden Hellenistic age with drama, plays, right? When they were doing all the different kinds of plays. And they realized it. Others have talked about it since. And now in hard neuroscience, we're finding, that's pretty close to the truth. There's about 3 to 5 primary archetypes. And there's 13 different storylines. Some of them are derivative of one another. Some of them are diametrically opposed to one another. So a hero archetype in one is actually an evil archetype, malevolent archetype in the other. And it's some gradient. And we can kind of understand, we can understand the other archetypes within our storyline. We can kind of understand adjacent storylines, kind of understand those archetypal, characters in there. But the farther we get away from our primary storyline, the less and less, we are able to comprehend people, right? Or comprehend the story at all. And we think we're in our own storyline when we're dealing with somebody with a little bit more influence and power than us, but we may not be. We may be living in their storyline, and it makes no sense to us. Well, these resentfuls, as I write about in the Eternal War, they're extraordinarily good at this. They understand this better than anything else. And this is when, all the big brain people talk about dialectics and this and all kinds of, epistemologies and all these big words I don't, to be quite frank, quite understand. But they're sure serious about it. I hear it a lot, right? But give me a second. We are each living an archetype in a storyline. And the enemies know this extraordinarily well, and they know how to play it, and they know how to take somebody who's a similar resonant archetype from another storyline and confront us with it. But in that storyline, that individual is not a good person, right? That person's got a whole different motivations that we got. But there's a little bit of a pattern recognition. Well, they know this, and this is what they feed through entertainment. It's what they feed through education. It's what they, it's also why they try to collapse it all down to where we're all the same. So that you can be preyed upon by one of the archetypes that would normally be an ally in your storyline is not an ally in another storyline, the storyline that they live in. Right. And what is that storyline? That's the narrative, right? It's the narrative, neurocognitive, neuroemotive narrative space, that they live in. It's also why they work so hard to remove natural law, because natural law allows for the individuation right down to these subtle levels so that you can really understand where that actual person involved in the case is actually coming from and what their motivations were and was their intent.
Right. I sometimes like to think of this on the elite level as the difference between statecraft and stagecraft. And you have to be very careful to be typecast into a role that has been prepared for you rather than to organically discover a narrative that emerges out of the actual fundamental patterns of your life that you are engaged in. I think this is why the internet does have this tendency to, or lots of people who quote unquote succeed in the online environment become oftentimes unconsciously or without realizing it, typecast by the selection dynamics of engaging with an audience in a particular way, right? There's this pretty common, I don't know how common, but there's a very strong example of this in the case of this one, I think, YouTuber. I forget what his name was, but apparently he was a regular dude just posting videos to YouTube and then started kind of doing, I think, one video just about eating something. Some kind of food, and then that got him a lot of attention, and then he kept doing food videos, and then over time ballooned into this absolute enormity of a guy, and essentially his life was ruined by following the tacit pull of slightly increased attention in a self-reinforcing loop, and ends up being this kind of very hideous and unattractive and miserable person. And this same kind of dynamic happens in real life and on the internet as well in other variations. And so you have to be very careful to not only act out a storyline that you have genuinely kind of internalized, but also when the way that you move through the world exposes you to a certain set of incentives much more than others. I think this is why what you just said is so important with natural law. When you can actually fundamentally account for the incentives that are at play in your life, then you can make a different choice to seek out different incentives. From what I understand, your own story is very much like that. You had a breaking point in your life where you realized that you had been, that what you needed really was to essentially get hit in the face by the military environment where there is no means to offset or delay a conflict that is going to come to you. You cannot argue your way out of a hostile encounter where the really strong fundamental incentives are at play. So perhaps you can say a bit about what moved you into that experience. Why did you make that choice? And perhaps then also whether that had an influence on how you think of your mission today.
Yeah. One of the things that we find, and Peter and Jen Buffett with their Nobel Foundation and Gary Schwartz helped fund us and back us in some work we did on identity stack. And that's not what we intended to do. We intended to try and help some veterans in their area, et cetera. But one of the things we were finding, this is several years ago, and I was finding in my own recovery and rebuilding, is that once you occur sufficient brain injury, whether it's from a physical blows, or from toxicity, which can be heavy metals, toxins in the air, or it could also be prolonged forms of certain kinds of stress, emotional, psychological, et cetera, stress, that once you have sufficient enough brain injury, your identity stack collapses. And it's never coming back, because an identity stack is all of the things that, one is your innate nature. And yes, we do have innate natures. We are not blank slates at all. And we're finding that less and less, right? Nature versus nurture. It's like even the nurture was actually created by the nature that's in your genes, because that nature or that nurture is created by the genetics that you have, but in the form of your parents and grandparents and siblings, et cetera. So, and there's more to it, but the point is this. I had 2 guys kill themselves within 5 days, about 4 years ago, out of nowhere, right? Both of them. And both of them seemed to be doing really well. And so I guess this is about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So that really struck me, right? Because I was still heavily trying to recover myself. But the point is that many of us, most of us, don't actually know our real archetype. And we certainly don't know the narrative structure and system that we live in. Because from the time we're born, people, just little kids out on the playground, parents or others, or a community or entertainment or whatever, has tried to convince us that we are, has tried to prevent us from putting in the work and the time, and given us the tools to put in the work and time to know what archetype we are and what narrative story we're living in. And it's specifically done because then whatever identity stack you build on top of that, and we don't have a single identity, we have a stack of identities based off of who we're talking to, when we're talking to them, what the power structure dynamic is, what we need, so it's this whole portfolio of identities. Well, if you want to deny people agency, deny them their identity, have them build an identity stack on sand, right? Vibrating wet sand. So back to the question of why, this was something that I didn't understand about identity and all that later, till decade plus later. But I was already starting to realize that this is 2000s. I had spent all this time in technology. I'd spent all this time in finance. I'd been rising up the ladder. I'd built 2 tech companies. I was an analyst. I was going to be a partner in a new fund. I helped build algorithmic trading platforms, and I helped, all this stuff. I didn't enjoy any of it. Not a single day of it, right? Now, sometimes here and there, some cool would happen and be like, all right, that's awesome. But I didn't enjoy it. And there was a war going on. There was some, I wanted to know, who people really were outside the security bubble. And, in more than just as the target. So the Green Berets was the right path, because you do try, we are trained and oriented around trying to figure out local peoples and figuring out how to deconflict issues and help them work out this very stuff so that we can build something that, they're sustainable and we can go take on a common enemy, and or they can, have the resiliency to take on that enemy themselves. So I went into special forces and really resonated with it. It really connected with me, and it really helped me understand my archetype and what narrative line I was living in. Again, I didn't put that all together till, the TBI. This is, the resentfuls. There's two, there's a doctrinal line called reality, and there's another doctrinal line called target, which is you. And what are the resentfuls constantly doing? And this will get back to the social media and the constant presence and just this overwhelming with noise. There is a reason they're doing all of that. The reason they're doing all of that is because, and I'm watching it with my Gen Z daughter and her friends, they're cutting through all the noise and they are figuring out what their archetypes are, and they are building. And this has only been happening in the last 2 years. Before that, they were just bombarded, and they were too young at the time too, but they are taking a step back and they are identifying their own archetypes and their own narrative storylines that they're living in, and they're building their lives according to that. And I'm watching it, and it's astounding. It's exactly what the resentfuls don't want to happen. Because if people know, and this gets back to the natural law as well, right? Because if you're going to conduct English common law, common to all peoples, great or small, but if you're going to practice English common law, which is what allowed us to survive, thrive, it's how we are able to survive the Norman invasion. It's how we're able to survive to this day. It's why we've been so dominant in industry and innovation and everything for so long. If you're going to do that, then you have to look at each individual under common law individually, and you have to work out what archetype they believe they are, whether that's who their real archetype or not. You have to work out what archetype do they think they are, and what storyline are they actually playing out. This is fundamentally different than civil law. Civil law just assumes everybody's the same, and here's the prescribed list of punishments, right? So, this is why I went into special forces. This is I'll give you another piece. In men, there are two archetypes. I'll give you an example is what I'm getting at. In men, strong, capable men, there are two archetypes that can masquerade as the same archetype. It's the caregiver and the protector. But they're very different, right? They'll both go do ruthless things if they got to do ruthless things. But they handle it and process it very different. And there's a very different, fundamentally different narrative for each of them when they're going about it. And the protectors, they take the trauma and the stress of the ruthless stuff they have to do, and they become stronger from that, right? The healthy ones, not the psychopaths, sociopaths, right? The caregiver is torn up by what they did because they wanted to protect and help, and they did these horrible things that needed to be done in some cases, but it eats away at them. And so the two of them have to deal with the trauma and the stress and the narrative, the articulation and identification of their archetypes so that they could work on the narrative. And this is, again, back to what Novo Foundation and the family helped us do, is have some time and space to work through this, is that until recently, the dominant male, strong, capable male preferred archetype was the protector. but a lot of guys aren't protectors. That's a small percentage. There's a lot more men that are caregivers. Now they're male caregivers, they're not women caregivers. That's two very different, right? Female, male roles, etc. But that's just an example of how, and so what happens is we send a lot of these caregivers away to war and they come back and destroy themselves, right? And they can barely be the productive members of society, even though some do, that they should be. And okay, resentfuls love that. They love it because they're denying, they set up the medical system and the legal system in such a way that kind of work as to, okay, what is your real archetype, man? And oh, by the way, if a guy's a caregiver archetype and he goes and does the hard stuff, he's no less than a freaking protector, right? We need both. So this whole, back to the online social media, the movies, entertainment, the only people who get books published, et cetera, are all, and when you look at it down underneath, it is all about forcing everybody into the same archetype and this, the same archetype if they can get away with archetypes and shove us all into the same storyline. But that storyline, even if you look at it, is warping, adjusting, and twisting, is never, these things don't match. This is why movies suck now, because they're taking some segment out of one storyline for the archetypes and another segment out of another storyline for the archetypes, and it just doesn't fit together. It's all done on purpose so that we as human beings don't take a step back individually and go, okay, what archetype am I really? Not which one do I want to be, not which one do I think's cooler or is going to make me more money, to, the guy turned out to be a bad person, etc. It's because he didn't know what the hell his archetype was and he didn't stay true to it. And then we have to figure out, okay, well, which of these 13 storylines is the core storyline of my life? And then let me develop myself to function and operate as that archetype in that storyline, and things tend to work out, tend to do better. You tend to not get, as to use the example you said of the guy that went down the food pathway and became a nasty person. Well, that's what they want. They want to be able to tweak you there by you not taking the time. And they do it in the law. They do it in education, right? Everybody's the same, everybody's, etc. It's all done on purpose.
I think something for our audience to understand that I learned from you as well is that in our modern world in which we have so-called democratic governance or democratic systems that really have supplanted and killed off the old world, the system of reciprocal loyalties and duties that we're carrying that day, if you will. It is not easy or perhaps even possible for an average, for a regular person to have a relationship with a well-constituted social structure around them, that they can have meaningful ongoing feedback that tells them how and where they are in that social order and how to conduct themselves. Of course, we do have this still in some respects, people who have strong church communities, if those still exist, and if they're not just an act for everybody's kind of self-delusion that also exists, then you can kind of supplant it. You can have a replacement that way. You might have a particularly strong family that has a strong understanding of how they are in the world and why they organize themselves in a particular way. Perhaps the ones that you could point to today that are still doing this to some extent are, for example, the Amish or the Mormons, right? Like you might disagree about their religious perspective or their particular way of organizing, but you cannot deny that they have a way of organizing and they exercise it. And so when you exist in a democratic structure or in a structure where governance is nominally in the hands of so-called politicians, which really are little more than the hired help or the managers that are brought to the fore by forces that have realized that when they put themselves in the limelight of rulership, they actually become targets themselves. And it's not actually quite a good use of the resources to do that. And therefore, perhaps it's better to simply hire people and put them into the popular imagination and have them rise to the top. But I guess what I'm saying is, if you wish to understand your own storyline and your own archetype, what are even reliable ways to discern that? Is that something that you can figure out by doing deep reflection? Is it something that you actually require kind of a community to be around? Is it something that is given by the kind of global circumstances you're subject to? How do you think about finding what that archetype actually is? And is it something that's as an individual thing or something that's part of a social structure more?
Yeah, it's an individual thing. We see the remnants of it as early as kids and 2 years of age. Really starts to show itself by the time they're 4. So it's an individual thing. It's innate. This is just how we're wired. I'm not a terribly big fan of Sigmund Freud, but he wasn't an idiot. There is one thing Freud said one time that I think is the most powerful statement that he made. Reality, or I think it's the most true thing that he said. And Freud said, you can't trust your mind until you've broken it and rebuild it yourself. Right? That doesn't mean go insane, doesn't mean go crazy. It just means go look at all of your biases, all of your comforts, all of your disquiets, look at all of these things that emotively move you or keep you in neutral, and then break them and see where you naturally come. Right? Again, it's not about going crazy or driving yourself crazy or being crazy or any of that. It's just, I benefit from having studied Zen Buddhism from when I was young. And there's the concept of the koan, Koan, Zen koan. And I think everybody should study koans. Now, they're going to be tailored to you and who you are, et cetera, for it to be right. But there's some of them that are kind of universal, right? Like, what is the sound of one hand slapping? Well, these are seemingly nonsensical questions, but what they do is they break you through patterned word constructs,
yes,
which is, that internal narrative. And so to your question, I think people need to break their mind. And you have to do it over some years because it took years to condition you. Years, at least a decade to condition you the way you are, in some cases 2-3 decades. So people need to break their mind. They need to go after their biases and they need to try and become bias free.
Right.
And that's hard. There's 287 charted, known cognitive biases. There's a great wheel that has them all laid out. I can't remember what it is. I have it saved here
Cognitive bias index, yeah.
Yeah, cognitive bias index is marvelous. It's brilliant. Well, everybody needs to study that and look at their own life.
Right.
And you'll find that some of the things that you believed hold true, and you'll find that some of them don't. Right? So and then I'll give you one other piece there. The other piece is what people have to accept is that we are all living in artificial status hierarchies. The pursuit of wealth is supposed to be the servant, not the master. Mm-hmm. But we've made life the servant, and we've made money, wealth, the master. Right. That's inverted. And anytime you're in a culture or society that has that inversion, everything is artificial. It's a completely artificial status hierarchy. And so you have to look at yourself and say, okay, yes, I need to break myself to figure out if these cognitive biases are mine or programmed into me. Am I naturally this way? But you have to do so with the confidence of taking on this massive, now almost 400-year-on artificial reality and all the artificial status hierarchies within it.
Right.
And it took a long time. It took over a decade, almost 2 decades, for me to stop pursuing wealth. Once I did, which to be quite frank was only fairly recently when I finally fully accepted I'm done. told people, hey guys, I'm out of this. Let me hand off this relationship. Let me move this to here and give that to you guys. And right, I'm out of the wealth game or pursuit of wealth game. Once I did that just here recently, it's like everything's changed. Now I'm on my path. Now I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Now I'm true to my archetype, my narrative.
Right.
Right. But I had to throw off those status hierarchies and the fact, okay, I'm not going to have that. I'm not going to have that. I'm not going to have that. And because of that, I'm not going to be here in status hierarchy or here and that.
Right. I came across a paper at some point recently on this theory of causal emergence. And I'll explain why this is relevant in just a moment. But essentially what causal emergence states or postulates, or actually demonstrates experimentally, not just theoretically, is that a system can always be described at multiple levels of resolution, right? Like you can talk about a computer at the level of the code that's running on it. You can talk about it at the level of the bits that are being turned off and on. You can talk about it at the level of the voltage perhaps that's running
the
through it,
electron
right?
flows.
Exactly. And so there's multiple levels at which you can talk about a system, and all of these are operating at, simultaneously. And so there's a question about, okay, which of these levels contributes more to the actual behavior of the system with respect to the others? And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is that if you haven't put the kind of inherited and in natural and also cultivated structures that you consist of to a strong test, if you haven't put pressure upon them, then you are merely but an extension of the forces that created you. And you have very little capacity to actually independently maneuver with respect to the forces that are swaying you this way or that way in the world. And so recently I was in El Salvador speaking at a conference called Palestra Forum, which was also visited by the brother of Bukele, and I got to speak with him as well. But my presentation there was essentially about what we leave behind, the legacy that we as civilizations leave behind, because this is something that that country is only now putting some energy into discovering again, partially as an investment to actually understand its own inheritance so that it can confidently move forward into a future with actual knowledge of its past. But until you understand what conditioned you, until you put that to the test, you don't have that capacity to make those choices yourself. And so once you do make those choices, once you do put that to the test, then you can actually make choices, and you can actually set in place alternative structures that give rise to what I would call a kind of second birth, right? Like you have the first birth where your mother brings you into this world, and then for the first however many years, you are simply the recipient of forces much greater than you. And then at some point that can flip if you are afforded the ability to engage directly with reality. I think this is something that I was deeply, deeply desirous of when I was in university, because I had been buffeted from direct engagement with reality for all of my growing up, right? Like my father worked at the same job his entire life. My school environment was one where the teachers and that environment is setting up your calendar, your goals, the way you go about achieving those goals, all of those things. And so I dropped out of a university and then left that in search of direct engagement with reality, and then joined this group in Chile called Exosphere, where we were actually living in relative poverty, but we were doing things with a mission in mind, and both suffering the consequences of our imperfect actions, but also reaping the rewards of being engaged in a joint venture, if you will, of doing something that mattered to us. And so I guess what I want to say is, and what I want to invite people to consider is that, have you had actual experiences where there was no force mediating your engagement with reality? If you haven't, then you are likely still an unconscious extension of the forces that move your life. And if you have, then you probably have some proportional additional measure of agency that lots of the people around you perhaps don't have. And you can play this game to its logical conclusion by examining all of the foundations upon which your life stands. And of course, today it's, you spoke to this earlier, that the foundations on which we stand have been carefully crafted over centuries now to produce all the wrong incentives for us to actually engage directly with reality, and then to take on the responsibility, not just the privilege, of owning our relationship with reality and structuring it in ways that advance the interests that we have individually and that we share with those around us. So I think this is something that the English civilization in particular kind of really figured out, right? Like it's this, we need to invest in and defend and support the capacity of the individual with agency to select the way they engage in the world and to benefit from doing so. And collectively we will reap the rewards and actually make it possible for a lot of these tribes that are otherwise very much unlike one another to somehow have relative peace and prosperity. So how do you think about kind of what sets the English civilization apart? What perhaps is the secret of its success? And is it still something that applies today, or are there attacks on it or renovations of it that are necessary?
Yeah. The great innovation of the English civilization, as set forth by a king and fought for by 2 more kings and others after. So kings aren't all bad, princes aren't all bad, and the barons fought for it too. And oh, by the way, the barons had the people with them to fight because they couldn't fight enough. There wasn't enough barons to fight the king's armies, right? When you got a bad king. So, but and a huge part of this actually is something that His Majesty Alfred the Great and his grandfather Eccleston, Eccleston before him, worked out, was actually from the Danes, from the Scandinavians. And the Scandinavians were fiercely independent, fiercely sovereign, which is what had to happen in order for the Scandinavians, with 6 months of winter and very short growing season, growing seasons to be able to organize, coordinate, etc. So a lot of what we think of as English civilization, Anglo-Saxons, which is right there as well, right? But a lot of what we think of as Anglo-Saxon innovations were actually, came over with the Dane law, etc. But point being is this: between the Anglo-Saxon peoples, the Britons, the Scots, the Irish, all of which were fiercely independent type peoples, the concept and idea that Alfred the Great, His Majesty, really codified was that it's not just that you're individually sovereign. That's not enough. You have to be responsible. You have to be responsibly individually sovereign. And I think that that's, we shouldn't be saying individually sovereign, because then you get this person walking around, I'm me because I'm me.
Sovereign individual, yeah. I think one of the greatest tragedies is that liberalism was called liberalism rather than responsibilism. And it didn't need to be said back then, but that is what it meant.
Yeah, very good. So when we say individual sovereignty, I believe we need to put the most critical word there, which is responsible individual sovereignty. I am responsible. What does that mean? Well, I've got to get off my derriere. I got to figure out what my archetype is. I got to figure out what storyline I'm in, and then how do I contribute from there? And whatever that may be. And I remain responsible, engaged, fully engaged, always, every minute, from the day I'm born to the day I die. I am engaged in ensuring not only my own responsible individual sovereignty, but the individual sovereignty of others who are being responsible.
Right. That's actually what friendship...
What's that? Well, I was going to say, if they're not being responsible, well, then they don't have individual sovereignty.
Right.
And this is the thing that's been corrupted most, and they've stripped out the concept of responsible individual sovereignty and just went to individual sovereignty. So everybody's got a right. Everybody's equal. Everybody's this. No. Right. It also is what gets to, as I'm working mostly now on trying to understand what the English civilization is and what is its differentiation, etc. This responsibility thing, that every individual is common under the law because each member accepts their responsibility.
Right. But it's
Not
only
just
really
to operate
possible-
within the law, but to operate within society responsibly. Sometimes that means, in the English civilization specifically, that sometimes we go to war with the status hierarchy, our own status hierarchy or external status hierarchies, because they're trying to impose something artificial to us. They're trying to take our individual sovereignty from us in all these various diverse forms. And that's where we are today. Where we are today is steadily over the last 60 years, this responsible portion has been stripped out completely. The last person who said it was Kennedy, and they shot him and his brother.
Right, right. And so in some of your recent appearances, you've been analyzing kind of what seems to be happening or appears to be happening from a certain perspective behind the scenes as to what you've called kind of the Responsibles faction, having prepared now for the better part of 60 years to kind of make an attempt to move it back in the opposite direction. I don't know whether that's the best way of putting it, but yeah.
To restore organic versus synthetic or artificial status hierarchies.
Right.
Because everything that happens in the world is determined by incentive structures. And those incentive structures are either in support of organic or synthetic status hierarchies. Wealth is an artificial status hierarchy. Life is an organic status hierarchy. Right? So the ways in which we organize ourselves and the productivity and the defense of our peoples and lands when we hold human life as sacrosanct, as master, are fundamentally different than the incentive structures of the artificial system that puts wealth primary and life is a commodity.
Right, right. And I sometimes view the world wars, or you could also consider them European brother wars, really, the death knell of that earlier system of distributed responsibility and duties. And go ahead.
I think if we look at, okay, so sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think this is an important point you're making, because I touch on this a lot in my thinking, mention it every once in a while, but World War I, we have never collectively, either continental Europe or the English-speaking peoples, again, two very distinct peoples, despite the psyop to try and make us the same for a couple hundred years. World War I broke Western civilization and English civilization, and it robbed us. One, it was purely inhumane. It firmly demonstrated that the people who were in power, secretly or not, were all in on the wealth path, on the building the status hierarchies in the world and the incentive structures in support of that, of the artificial world versus life, and that was demonstrated in the way they just casually threw away millions of lives.
Right.
And then and psychologically, we've not recovered from the blast injuries, so we've got all that epigenetic memory. That's not woo-woo stuff. That's just genetics. And so we got all that epigenetic memory. And then what happens, you look at like Picasso and other people's art, and you can literally see where we went from this beauty and beautiful and extraordinary things to this insanity in the arts. We've never recovered from that. And then what we do, we double down with communism, killing hundreds of millions of people, just totally all in on the wealth status hierarchies, and World War II. And then we've been at nonstop war since 1939.
Right.
All in on artificial status hierarchies, all in on wealth as master. Life is not even servant, but life is a commodity.
Right.
We have got to go back to the world pre-World War I. Now, that doesn't mean second law of thermodynamics is a god for all intents and purposes, right? The laws of conservation and energy and the laws of thermodynamics are more powerful than any god that anybody writes books about, right? And the second law of thermodynamics is irreversibility. You don't get to go back.
Right.
And quite frankly, I don't want to go back. I want to get to a type 1 civilization. That would be like the most extraordinary thing we could do is get
Harder
to type
stuff.
1, right?
Right.
So, but when it comes to putting the current master back in its position of servant and putting, for all intents and purposes, the best way for us to articulate life as master, that is putting our civilization back in the role of master and wealth back in the role of servant in support of that. And what is our civilization? At its very basic, in all of its immense complexity, civilization is it's not glorification, forgive me, I'm trying to find the right word. It is an honoring of the beauty and extraordinariness of life. Human life in particular, and not just life and human life, but the life of our people, our histories, our bloodlines, right? And that's not just, people go, oh, ethnic stuff, racial stuff, and all that. Well, sorry, there is some of that there. But we're also, a people that our civilization has welcomed in a lot of people. And if those people embrace the principles, concepts, and ideas of our civilization, well, they're part of our civilizational peoples.
Right, but welcoming peoples into that compact does not mean that you give up your claim to your stake of that civilization, right? I think
Correct.
this is the important part that
I owe you nothing. My ancestors owe you nothing.
Right, right.
I don't get anything because of my ancestors that I don't have to work my derriere off every day.
And they also paid heavily in blood and treasure for
Correct.
creating it. I think
Correct.
this is something that is still widely misunderstood. I think in the European extended world. I mean, I'm going to use this just as a descriptor, even if there's precision underneath it. But I think those world wars really robbed us of the confident and self-aware expression of our individual and collective ability to judge reality for what it is and to confidently stand amongst it. Because in demonstrated reality, we, or at least our elites or our rulers, failed to prevent it. And that alone is indictment enough that the way that that system worked, or the way that those people were constituting themselves, was either not right, or they simply failed to defend against the forces that were working to take them down. I think it is therefore an obvious difficulty to reconstitute that kind of confidence. And I think this is where your kind of perspective here is going to be very important, because you're going to, say what you're going to say, and then I'll lead us into the end.
So I think you're onto another very critically important piece here, right? We need to be very careful not to blame everything on our elites. Back to the very beginning of this conversation about Praetorians. Mm-hmm. Many of them were not acting of their own volition and hadn't for 100+ years. Mm. So that's one piece. The second piece is the people who got slaughtered, and the people and the families of them are actually equally, if not more, guilty of the destruction of our civilizations in World War I, because they didn't revolution the people sending them there. Responsible individual sovereignty also means standing up to the wrong in your own community, in your own civilization, your own society. In yourself. So and then what do? We turned right around and repeated it in World War II, but only on a bigger scale.
Right.
And we've been doing it ever since. And quite frankly, I'm not calling for it. I don't want it, but I don't see any way around it. I believe a revolution's coming. I think it's probably already underway.
Yes.
They're going to try and channel us to go hard ethno-nationalist. That's the pattern. We can't allow that. We do have to get rid of vast sums of people because they don't belong here. And I don't blame them. It's not their fault. They had an opportunity. They took it.
Yeah.
I blame us for not standing up before, and just like World War One, I blame us, the people,
Right.
for World War One. I blame us, the people, for World War II. I blame us, the people, for the nonstop wars. Why? Because we didn't get out of our comforts. We fell for the servant becoming master, and we decided to all participate in these artificial status hierarchies. We are to blame. It is the people who hold leaders accountable. It is the people that, if their leader has a knife at their throat, has to free that leader from that knife at their throat, and then see if that leader is legitimate or not. And then maybe remove them if they're not legitimate. But you can't know that when every bit of your perception of that person, particularly for the royal houses, because they're there from birth, don't think for a second our perception of His Majesty King Charles hasn't been shaped on purpose with immense expenditure and immense investment to make sure that we hate him, to make sure that everything's blamed on him as if he's this omniscient, all-powerful monarch. He's not. And his grandfather was killed. Probably his mother. Probably his ex-wife. All his ways to keep him in line and keep him in check. Meanwhile, his security is owned and provided, not by him. Right. The royals haven't provided their own security since the 1600s. It's government.
I want to kind of double click on this point, because it is, I think, something absolutely crucial to understand for the people who listen to this, which is, if you are distraught at the state of the world, and if you say you care about things moving in a better direction, then the obvious first inference is that the people in charge are malicious or lying or incompetent, and that's where your ire naturally flows, right? And the forces behind the scenes rely on that to be the case, such that you are reliably goaded into the kind of easiest answer that makes you...
Pitchforks and torches at night.
Yes, and it is exactly this quality of directing our ire at the people who take on risk for the collective that is relied upon for us to never actually address the underlying problems.
Correct.
And this is also
why
not
even ever see it.
Right. This is why I keep coming back to that the fundamental skill that we need to practice is to recognize your betters when they stand before you. And I guess now from this conversation I should take out of that the second implied virtue there is to come to their aid when you see them under duress. And it is this quality that will make it possible for leaders to actually rise up again and to also take risks on behalf of us.
Correct.
And until we do that, that will not happen. The leaders will continue to opt out of taking risks on behalf of the populace because it does not pay. They simply get the slings and arrows for no reward.
There you go. It's not even that it doesn't pay, it's that it's not safe.
Right.
And so what are they supposed to, and people keep saying, well, they should fall on their sword. It's like, what would that change?
Yes.
Then you have nobody fighting for you and you are totally enslaved.
Right.
And oh, by the way, a whole number of them across history, when you actually look, have been murdered.
Right.
Have been killed. They did try. The Kennedys tried. Reagan was trying. They shot him. And there's this whole anti-Reagan thing now. Well, people need to look at pre-gunshot Reagan and post-gunshot Reagan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Patton as well. There's a number of people throughout history who've done this and who were taken out or had to change their tune.
Do you know why they didn't take out MacArthur? This is quite literal. They didn't take out MacArthur because MacArthur had been in the military for 50 some odd years. And his father had earned their father-son Congressional Medal of Honor recipients. And there were soldiers, the U.S. military soldiers, that if they had taken out MacArthur, they would have acted on their own behalf, and some very high-ranking people involved in that would have died.
That's the kind of loyalty that you can inspire when you take risks on behalf of
That's why they retired MacArthur and they didn't take him out.
Right.
Patton, on the other hand, because he was he didn't have as much time in the military, and he is a fundamentally different personality. He didn't have that kind of loyalty. Could have built it. The other one they killed because he had he had the capacity where if he ever rallied the people, they would have come to him, was Lawrence of Arabia. And they killed him too. And he knew how to do unconventional warfare, and he knew how to fight them and all that, so he had to die. Patton knew how to fight too. He would have just come head on. But the point I'm getting at is to this conversation is that the reason MacArthur survives because he had his own security. He had his own security contract, shall we say, right? Something happens to me, completely independent of me, there's some very powerful people going to get probably wiped out.
I'm very glad we arrived at this point in the conversation, because this leads into what I'm trying to do, and what also I believe is one of the critical things that you can bring to the program I'm doing, is this concept, like the search for a new but also old, perhaps role or archetype or way of being in the world that grants the people who adopt it a means to engage with reality head on, and to build lasting structures and relationships with the people that they are in relationship with. And I think you call it being a knight, right? And being a knight in the eternal war. I kind of call my version of this right now the modern Minuteman, because to my mind, at least in the American context, the Minutemen were kind of the everyman, the citizen soldier, the person who was engaged in regular life, but also at a minute's notice capable of rendering support to the armed forces engaging in conflict, right? And I think for the vast majority of people, that is the kind of role they can imagine themselves adopting and actually training for, right? And I think in our current and modern environment of this information world that we are constantly suffused in, the skills shift a bit as well from this kinetic capacity that the Minutemen of old were primarily capable in and had to be competent in, to a kind of economic, psychological, informational, spiritual even warfare or engagement that happens every minute that you scroll on social media, every moment of the day that you yourself are unwittingly deputized in service of forces that you don't understand or are even recognize, and that do not have your interests at heart. And so that's kind of how I'm viewing it right now, which is why I call it Modern Minuteman. But you have an idea of the knight. Can you say a bit more about that, and perhaps then lead that into what you're going to teach our people at my program?
Yeah, so one thing I want to go back about the Minutemen. The Minutemen were far more broadly capable than you articulated. They weren't just martially capable. They were loyal, and they were willing to fight for that loyalty. But they also provided, I've written about this, talked about this as well, veterans across all of American history and English history, et cetera, veterans after wars were the most stabilizing, balancing members of their community, because in addition to their martial capacities, they had a presence, and they had a calm, and they had their own demons, etc. But point being is that they had been tested and broken and damaged and repaired themselves in all these ways, and they'd seen all of these things that are very real, and they could see the artificial reality, and they could see what happened when conflict gets out of hand or isn't dealt with early. And so I've seen it. I've seen veterans when I was younger, Vietnam era veterans, step in and calm some conflict down at work, or get involved with, some, I've seen it even here more recently, where there's some spat going on in some local little political thing, and one of the vet guys will step in, he knows both parties, he'll have a conversation over at his house one night. And so there's this conflict resolution that's native to, particularly combat troops, but not solely. That's a huge stabilizing force in communities. So that goes way beyond just the martial capacities. With respect to the knights and the knightly stuff, well, the knights were administrators. They were governors. They were agricultural. So the 7 elements of power: diplomacy, information, martial, economics, finance, intelligence, and legal, law enforcement. They had to be masters of all 7 of those, because they had a subset of the population and the lands that they were responsible for. And they had to manage their own Minutemen, right? Citizenry, right? So when a knight arrived, he didn't just arrive by himself. He came with 25 or 50 men at arms. And the land had to be able to, the community and the lands had to be able to support and sustain that. Well,
right, and
you got to be
that
able to.
structure goes back all the way back into the Indo-European kind of.
Well, it's
back
long
history.
before. This is even in Roman times, right? You
Right.
still had this, right? So this is an ancient thing, goes all the way back. And so for me, it's, are they going to be knights and barons and all that? Yeah, probably not. But
We don't need the names to have the functional roles.
Correct. So, this is the level of local organization and leadership that the resentfuls and the artificial status hierarchy has steadily tried to remove. And now what do we have? We have chaos and conflict everywhere, and we're being flooded with people who will never belong. And once the welfare dries up, we've got a lot of serious problems.
We have a little preview of that coming up this upcoming month.
Right. And I don't blame those people either, right? People are all, sorry, we've been in economic depression since 2012. We've been in a recession since 2008 or 2001. That's just the reality of the actual numbers. And now we just can't hide it anymore.
Right. Just the asset prices that mask that.
All of it. Right. You drive anywhere in this country, north, south, east, west, and all the car parks are full with RVs and vans, and there's millions of people. And we look at the homeless, like, where'd they come from? When and where? That's not an accident. That's a direct result of the financial collapse that's been happening. And people are living, millennials and even older generations who sold their houses, they're all living, millions of them across the country, everywhere you go, not even in the car park, sometimes just on streets and pullouts. There's millions of people here living in, mobile homes and converted vans and their cars and everything else. So I don't blame, the folks that are on the welfare and all that, and they've been sold a lie and they've been kept on the modern plantation, and it's horrible. It's going to be rough for them. But I don't blame them. I blame the people who built that system and put those people in that kind of poverty and kept them there and locked them there. That's who I blame. That's the other thing, right? A knight needs to know who his real enemy is.
Right.
Because I am not going to take my men-at-arms, myself and my men-at-arms, and put a tax on my community to go fight some enemy that isn't the real enemy.
Right.
Meanwhile, as I'm off fighting, somebody's in financializing and stealing our, the assets and wealth of our community and seeding people that don't belong there that I'm going to have to come home. Like Tolkien touched on this. What happens at the end of Lord of the Rings? The hobbits go home and they got to fight foreign invaders in their own homes, in their own communities, and their own, and some of their own leaders that had, et cetera.
Right.
And they have to fight them, and they have a little war, right? Tolkien touched on this 100 years ago. So we have to, one of the things that we have to do, for the nightly stuff is better understand it's not just guns battles. You don't win wars with gun battles. You win wars with all these other things. Right? All these other capacities with which you couldn't fight the gun battle anyways for very long. You'll run out of everything. So that's the real difference, I think. But that's the real difference for Knight. I use the Knight, Knight's Modern Guidebook as an example because we did organize ourselves in these ways not so long ago, and it's what allowed for everything that we have today.
Right. But it has been, we have been taught to think of that era as the Dark Ages.
Correct.
Which produced nothing but misery and unbased people.
Which isn't true. I mean, look at all the most beautiful works of art and the most beautiful buildings and all that. They were all built or started in the Dark Ages.
I read a book, I forget what it was called, but it essentially said that the cathedrals in England were built by master craftsmen who for months upon months of the year could take time out of their working lives to dedicate to these collective projects. And they were able to do that because they lived in a functioning civilization with a working legal system of common law that made it possible for the fruits of one's labor to stay where they were
Correct.
actually produced, and to then leave you with the choice to dedicate yourself to public service, and not public service in the sense of I will go into a bureaucracy with a governmental position, but I will use my wealth and my resources and the loyalties of my people to build meaningful things for my people and for what we share in common with others.
So this is what happens when you are a civilizational people. You have the civilization is this complex immune system that does its best to prevent the parasitism that denies us the capacity to reinvest in our civilization.
Right.
And I'm terribly sorry, I can't recall the word right now, but the accoutrements and the demonstrations of our civilization, all of that's been siphoned off by the financialist by switching from civilization as master, life, to wealth as master, synthetic.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just parasitism, plain and simple. And our civilization is the only historical immune system. It's what civilizations are. That's why they're going so hard at erasing it for 300 some odd years. It's survived despite all of that. It's only really been faltering in the last 30 years, 20 years. I mean, I go back to the 80s. Our civilization was still, was the message. Yeah, the attacks were happening. They, even when I was in elementary school, it was already, anti-male and heavy feminist and intersectional. And this is back in the 70s, right? But our civilization was still going strong. We respected, we honored, we were grateful for where we come from. We loved it, right?
Right.
And then that gets corrupted to the state. We love our country. We love no, it's our civilization. And then from there, it just gets further. So point being is that's our civilization, our immune system has survived over 360 years. This is the English-speaking peoples. 360 years and really more. It's about 400 and some odd years of all-out attack at every level, everywhere, within and externally. And it's still survived. It's still here. We're going to fight it out. I unfortunately think we are fighting it out, but I think we're going to fight it out. Right. And so.
Well, if you who are listening want to learn more, please do go to Ian's website, ianberlingame.com. He has written on these subjects in various forms. The Modern Knights Guidebook is the most recent one. I haven't ordered that yet, but I should. The Eternal War as well, which is more about the kind of timeless patterns that people engage in, or that reality comes in. And I guess the open invitation as well to reach out to Ian and I to discover perhaps how you can be a part of this collective venture of retaking our civilization. And it does not look always like training to engage people on the battlefield, although it is good when you have those skills. And in fact, this is one of the areas where I'm quite aware of my own shortcomings. I did not have the perhaps benefit or privilege of going through military training or engaging in the martial domain, and so therefore I will not speak out of turn when it comes to the warriors who put their own skin in the game in ways that I cannot hope to emulate at this point. But all of us have a role to play in this, and so even if it is just to make food for the ones that do, or to have some help in reconnaissance of what are the people up to, or to report what's going on in your local community to people who are capable of acting on it. It's really only found once you start to engage with life in this direct head-on way, once you look for people that resonate with you, or that you resonate with, that are also engaged in the same conflict, and then to over time build strong, real relationships that are not mediated by the digital domain. I mean, one of the things I attribute the source of my quote-unquote success, or at least forward momentum to, is to find people early on in my early 20s that cared about these things, and then to engage with them for on an ongoing basis for more than 10 years now, and then meet them in person, and then build those relationships. And over time, you build a strong enough social environment that you no longer are engaging with the world as an individual that is divorced from responsibilities to people around them, but you do it as somebody who's responsible to the people around them that one cares about. So yeah, no, do you have any last things you want to impress upon our audience?
No, I think we talked it all. It's time to restore our civilization as master. And to do that, we need to really go back and look at our history with this critical eye. We need to also look at ourselves and make sure that we're not caught in artificial realities that we sustain because of our comforts or our discomforts. Because sometimes it's not our comforts, but we don't want to be discomfortable in certain ways, right? And because we don't want to face something. And we need to really go back and look at this, our English civilization. And oh, by the way, continental Europeans, you don't necessarily, I don't know that there's, yes, there's kind of the overarching Roman Catholic, but there's different cultures there, very powerful, old, important cultures. And you all need to do that in Europe as well, for your own self, for your own people, the Germans, the French, the Poles, right? You all have these long histories, and you have your own cultures and societies that are your immune systems, and you need to look at those too.
Right. It's the age-old and eternal answer to look back into the past, discover and reconnect with what is most real in your past, and then to essentially grow forward from that original seed rather than stay on a rotten trunk or branch. So
well said.
Excellent. I appreciate you coming on, Ian. For those of you who are interested in learning more from Ian, you can find his website at ianberlingame.com. And if you're interested in joining us for the upcoming Modern Minuteman campaign, which really is an offer to get into the fight and to understand what your role might be and to make this a practical endeavor in your day-to-day life, then you can go to modernminuteman.net, and if you want to join, you can use Ian's code Burlingame at checkout for $50 off. And I hope to see you there. So thanks again, Ian, for coming on, and we'll be talking soon.